There's a decision sitting somewhere in your life right now. You know what it is. You've thought about it in circles for weeks, and then stopped, because the thinking wasn't moving anywhere. The same answer kept coming back. The same doubt kept canceling it out. Today, that loop has a closing point. Mercury has been retrograde in Pisces since February 25th. That's what created the blurring, not just the delay. Pisces as a backdrop doesn't just slow thinking. It dissolves the edges of what you know, makes avoidance feel like patience. In late February, Saturn and Neptune met at 0 degrees Aries, removing structural clarity exactly when a new cycle was beginning. Today, two things happen in sequence. At 10:45 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, the Sun enters 0 degrees Aries, the exact first degree of the astrological year. Then, 5 hours later, at 3:32 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, Mercury stations direct. A station is not a gradual shift. It's the point of maximum pressure before release. The decision you've been circling for 3 to 4 weeks is not going to wait past today. Mercury direct breaks the specific pattern Pisces retrograde creates, the loop where you approach an answer and then pull back from it. What moves today isn't the situation around the decision. What moves is your internal position on it. The thing that makes today structurally different isn't Mercury direct alone. It's that Mercury stations 5 hours after the equinox, meaning whatever unlocks doesn't land back into the same fog. It lands into a different season entirely. In the next few minutes, you'll discover 3 things. First, why Mercury retrograde in Pisces created this specific avoidance loop, not general confusion, but the pullback pattern. Second, why the equinox and Mercury direct landing 5 hours apart on the same day makes this a structural break, not a slow recovery. Third, what the decision that's been sitting in your life is most likely to do today, and why you probably won't need to force it. You've been suspended between knowing and deciding for weeks. That suspension had a mechanism. That mechanism closes today at 3:32 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. What has been circling doesn't keep circling after its conditions end. Before the mechanism, before the dates, before the planetary positions. There's a pattern worth naming first. You got close to the decision, close enough to feel the weight of it. And then, not fear, exactly, not a reason to stop. Something shifted. A quiet internal step backward. The answer was right there. You saw it clearly. And then you found yourself thinking again, from the beginning. That happened more than once. Maybe you told yourself you needed more information. Maybe the timing didn't feel right. Maybe you set it aside for a few days to let things settle. And then a few days became 2 weeks, and 2 weeks became where you are now, still holding the same question. Here's what that actually is. It's not hesitation in the ordinary sense. Hesitation means you don't know. This is different. You kept arriving at the same answer. The problem was never the answer. The problem was that every time you got close to it, something pulled you back, cleanly, quietly, with what felt like a reasonable justification. That's the loop. Not going in circles because you're lost, going in circles because the exit kept disappearing. And if you're honest about it, there were moments when this felt like maturity, like sitting with it longer was the responsible thing to do. Like patience and wisdom were the same thing here. That feeling had a source, and it wasn't wisdom. It was a specific condition that's been active since late February, one that made avoidance feel exactly like good judgment, not just for you. For anyone moving through a real decision right now, the loop didn't feel emotional. It didn't feel confused. It felt mechanical, like something kept resetting the same moment. That's because it was mechanical. That pattern has a precise starting point, and it falls on a specific day in February. February 20th is where this starts. That's when Saturn and Neptune met at exactly 0 degrees Aries. Those two planets haven't been at the same degree since 1989. And the degree matters here. 0 degrees Aries is the first point of the entire zodiac. It's where new cycles are supposed to begin, where direction is supposed to feel clean and forward. Instead, what happened at that degree was a collision between structure and dissolution. Saturn is the planet that builds form, Deadlines, decisions, the ability to say, "This is what I'm doing." Neptune is the opposite. It blurs, it softens edges, it makes the boundary between what you know and what you're not sure about almost invisible. When they met exactly at 0 degrees Aries, they removed structural clarity at the precise moment a new cycle was opening. Not gradually, not as a slow drift. On a specific date, the scaffolding that normally holds a decision in place went soft. That was 5 days before Mercury turned retrograde. On February 25th, Mercury went retrograde in Pisces. And this is the part that's worth understanding precisely. Because Mercury retrograde in Pisces is not the same as Mercury retrograde in other signs. Mercury retrograde in general slows things down. Messages get missed, plans shift, that's familiar. Mercury retrograde in Pisces does something different. Pisces doesn't just delay, it dissolves. The edges of what you already know become unclear. Not because the knowledge disappeared, but because Pisces as a background makes certainty feel premature. Makes holding a firm position feel like you're missing something. Makes waiting feel wise. So the mechanism was layered. Saturn and Neptune had already removed the structural anchor. Then, Mercury went retrograde inside a sign that specializes in making solidity feel suspect. The result wasn't confusion. It was a very specific pattern. You'd approach the answer, it would feel almost clear, and then the ground under it would soften just enough to make you step back. That's not a character flaw. That's what that configuration does. And it held. It held through most of March. The loop kept running, not because you were avoiding the decision consciously, but because the condition that makes pullback feel logical was still active. Then, 48 hours ago, March 18th, a new moon formed at 28 degrees Pisces, the last degree of the zodiac. That's not a coincidence of timing. A new moon at 28 degrees Pisces closes the Pisces cycle. It's the ending point of the same water that's been blurring your edges since late February. The loop was already on the way out when that new moon formed. But the mechanism, the specific pullback pattern, was still running. Mercury hadn't changed direction yet. That changes today. And it changes at a precise time. The endpoint of this isn't vague. It's not, things will improve soon. It's a specific planetary station at a specific hour, and it doesn't land back into the same conditions that created the loop in the first place. Today has 2 events. They don't happen at the same time. The sequence between them is the point. At 10:45 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time this morning, the sun moved into 0 degrees Aries. That's the equinox, the first degree of the astrological year, not a symbolic first degree. The literal starting point of the zodiac, the same degree where Saturn and Neptune met in February and removed the structural ground from under your decision. The sun entering that degree doesn't fix what Saturn and Neptune loosened. What it does is mark a hard seasonal boundary. The Pisces backdrop, the one that made avoidance feel like patience, the one that kept dissolving the edges of what you knew, that backdrop is now behind you. As of this morning, the sky moved into different territory, but Mercury was still retrograde when the sun crossed that line. That's important, because if Mercury had stationed direct before the equinox, whatever released would have landed back into Pisces conditions, back into the same fog. The loop would have ended, but the context would have stayed the same. That's not what's happening today. Mercury stations direct at 3:32 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 5 hours after the equinox. The gap between those 2 events is not coincidence. It's the structural difference between a slow recovery and a clean break. The sun moved first. It changed the season. Then Mercury changes direction inside that new season. So whatever releases at 3:32 p.m. doesn't return to where it was stuck. It arrives somewhere else. A station is worth understanding precisely because it's not what most people expect. Mercury hasn't been gradually speeding up toward direct motion. A station is the moment of complete stillness before reversal. The planet appears to stop entirely, maximum pressure, 0 movement, and then shifts direction. If you felt an unusual tension in the last day or two, a kind of tightening around the decision you've been holding, that's what a station feels like from the inside. Not chaos, not noise. a specific compression like something is about to give. At 3:32 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time today, it gives. And here's what that means for the loop specifically. The pullback pattern, the one where you approach an answer and then retreat from it, that pattern requires two conditions to keep running. It needs Mercury retrograde, and it needs Pisces as the backdrop. After 3:32 p.m. today, neither condition is in place. Mercury is direct, the Sun is in Aries. The loop doesn't have the architecture it needed to keep resetting. If you're watching this before 3:32 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, you're still in the station, still in the point of maximum pressure. That's not a problem. It means the release hasn't happened yet, but it's not delayed. It's on schedule. If you're watching this after 3:32 p.m., it already landed, not with a sound, not with a sudden clarity, more like a shift in internal temperature. The thing you've been circling feels slightly different than it did yesterday. Less slippery, more like something you can actually hold. What you can hold now is different from what you could hold last week, not because the answer changed, but because the ground under it stopped softening. Most people at this point are waiting for the instruction, what to do, how to move, what action to take between now and the end of the day. That's the wrong question, and the reason it's wrong is the most useful thing this configuration can tell you. The loop you've been inside didn't stall because you lacked courage or clarity or the right information. It stalled because a specific mechanism kept pulling you back every time you got close. That mechanism was not yours. It was a temporary condition with a start date and an end date, and the end date is today. Which means the thing you actually need to do is almost nothing. Not because action doesn't matter, but because the obstacle was never in front of you. It was behind you, pulling, and you can't push your way free from something that's pulling from behind. You just have to wait for it to release. After 3:32 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, it releases. What Mercury direct in this specific context means is not, now you'll suddenly know what to do. The answer isn't new. The answer has been coming back to you for weeks. You've seen it, you've held it, and then, every time, something dissolved it just before it could settle. What changes after the station is not the answer. What changes is that the answer stops retreating. If you sit with the decision tonight, after 3:32 p.m., and you notice that the familiar pullback doesn't happen, that you can hold the thought to the end without it slipping, that's not you being braver or more decisive than you were last week. That's the mechanism being gone. The distinction matters. Because if you believe the change came from you forcing it, you'll keep forcing things long after the forcing is done. But if you understand that the pullback had a structure and that structure ended, you can trust the stillness that follows. You spent weeks telling yourself it wasn't time yet, that you needed more information, that the picture wasn't complete. Some version of, I'll know when I know. That wasn't patience. That was Pisces retrograde doing exactly what it does, making avoidance feel like wisdom, making the retreat feel like the mature move. Today is the first day since February 25th that the same internal voice doesn't have planetary support. Whatever it says tonight, it's saying it without the same architecture behind it. This is not a call to act immediately. It's something quieter than that. It's permission to notice that the ground under the decision feels different, more solid, less likely to shift when you press on it. You don't need new courage for this. You need to notice that the hand on your shoulder, the one that kept pulling you back, is no longer there. The decision doesn't need to be made under pressure. It doesn't need to be forced into shape today. What it needs is for you to stop expecting it to dissolve again, because the thing that was dissolving it has ended. But the absence of that obstacle is only the first part. The second part is recognizing where, specifically, this particular release lands in your life, because Mercury doesn't move everything equally. It moves in specific territories. And the territory this retrograde occupied tells you exactly where the internal shift is most likely to show up first. Mercury doesn't rule everything. It has specific territory, and knowing the territory tells you where to look for the shift. Mercury rules thinking and the decisions that come from it. Communication, what you've been holding back from saying, or what you've been trying to say and couldn't find the right form for. Direction, the choice between two paths that both seemed reasonable, but one of them kept feeling slightly more right, even when you couldn't defend it clearly. And internal position, the thing you already knew but hadn't said out loud to anyone, including yourself. What it doesn't rule is external circumstances. Mercury direct doesn't change someone else's behavior. It doesn't alter the situation around your decision. What it moves is where you stand in relation to it, your internal orientation, your ability to hold a position without it slipping. That's a meaningful distinction, because the situation may look identical tomorrow to how it looked last week. The external facts haven't changed. What's different is that your internal read on it has stabilized, and that stability, quiet as it is what allows the situation to start moving, because situations follow internal positions more often than people expect. Now, the type of decision that tends to get frozen in a Mercury retrograde in Pisces window is specific. It's almost never purely logistical. If your stuck decision was about a schedule, a budget, a concrete plan, it probably didn't loop in the way this configuration creates. Those decisions stall under Mercury retrograde generally, but they don't create the particular pullback pattern. The pullback pattern, approach, retreat, tends to happen when the decision carries emotional weight that hasn't been fully named. Not necessarily dramatic weight, sometimes it's small. A conversation you've been putting off with someone who matters to you. A choice about work that would require you to admit quietly what you actually want. A relationship position you've been holding in a state of deliberate ambiguity because naming it felt like too much commitment to an outcome you're not certain about. Pisces retrograde freezes those decisions specifically, not because they're harder than logical decisions, but because Pisces as a backdrop makes emotional clarity feel like overconfidence. Like if you're certain, you must be missing something. Like the responsible thing is to keep the question open. So if your decision falls into any of these categories, what you say to someone, what you admit to yourself about a direction where you actually stand in a relationship or a professional situation, that's where the Mercury station lands most directly. That's where the internal position that's been retreating stops retreating. You don't need to speak it today. You don't need to act on it by 3:32 p.m. What you'll notice, if you pay attention, is that thinking about it tonight feels different from thinking about it yesterday. The thought reaches its end. It doesn't loop back to the beginning. For some people watching this, the decision is relational, something between you and another person that's been sitting in a state of unnamed tension. For others, it's directional, a choice about work, a project, a path that kept feeling almost right but never fully formed. For others, it's entirely internal, a position about your own life that you haven't given yourself permission to hold yet. The configuration doesn't care which category yours falls into. It held them all in the same way, and it releases them all through the same mechanism, not by giving you new information, but by letting the answer you already had stay in place long enough to become something you can actually work with. By the end of today, the question isn't whether the decision is ready. The question is whether you're willing to stop waiting for it to retreat, because that retreat no longer has anything driving it. And once you recognize that, there are 3 specific things worth doing before tomorrow morning. Not to force the decision, to keep it from slipping back out of habit, even after the mechanism that created the habit is gone. Habits don't end the moment their cause does. The loop ran for almost 4 weeks. Your nervous system learned it. The pattern of approach and retreat became automatic, not because you chose it, but because it kept being reinforced. Even after 3:32 p.m. today, that reflex can still fire out of habit, even with nothing behind it. That's why what you do in the next 12 to 18 hours matters, not to force anything, to keep the momentum from being swallowed by a reflex that no longer has a reason to exist. 3 steps. They're small. That's intentional. The first one is for today, after 3:32 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, before you go to sleep. Write 1 sentence about your decision, not a pros and cons list, not a paragraph of reasoning. 1 sentence that says what you already know. No but at the end of it, no qualifier, no escape hatch, just the thing you keep arriving at before the retreat starts. You've written that sentence in your head dozens of times over the past few weeks. This time, put it somewhere outside your head. A note on your phone, a piece of paper, anywhere. The act of writing it isn't magic. It's just harder to unsee than a thought. It stays in place in a way that thoughts under Pisces retrograde conditions didn't. The second step is for tonight. Don't go back to it. Don't reopen the analysis. The loop lived inside the analysis. Every time you turn the question over again, you gave it another chance to dissolve. Tonight, give the internal position 12 hours without examination, not suppression, not distraction, just the deliberate choice not to reopen the file before morning. Mercury post-station builds clarity slowly, not all at once. The first window is the most important, because if you restart the analysis tonight, you're not getting new information. You're just running the old pattern without the conditions that created it, which is a different kind of noise. The third step is tomorrow morning. Look at the sentence you wrote, not to judge it, just to see if it held. If it's still true, if you read it in the morning light and it doesn't immediately feel wrong, that's not a coincidence. That's Mercury post-station doing exactly what it does, not giving you a new answer, giving the old answer enough stability to be seen clearly for the first time in weeks. The clarity that comes after a station isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up as a sentence that doesn't change overnight. And if you're thinking, what if it does change? What if I wake up and it feels different? Then you look at what changed and why. But do that from a post-station position, not from inside the loop. The difference is that tomorrow you're examining a stable thing. You're not chasing something that keeps moving. One more thing worth knowing before this closes. The next significant moment in this sequence is March 25th, 6 days from now. The Sun reaches Saturn in Aries. That's not a threat. It's a test of form. Whatever shifted internally today will meet a structural moment at the end of the month, a point where what you decided or recognized or stopped avoiding gets asked to hold weight in real conditions. The people who are in a different position by March 25th are the ones who didn't wait for the external situation to change first. They let the internal shift land today, held it overnight, and carried it forward. 6 days is enough time, but only if the movement starts now. Mercury direct landed. The retrograde that held this loop in place since late February is over. The configuration that made avoidance feel logical no longer has the same structure behind it. What remains isn't resolution, it's movement without yesterday's friction. The noise that kept the decision blurred is lower. The answer isn't fully formed yet, but it no longer keeps retreating from you. Something in this sequence is still unfolding. The Sun just entered Aries, Saturn is 4 degrees ahead in the same sign, and what was set in motion today will become more legible over the next several days. Today broke the suspension. What it released is still finding its shape. Subscribe and stay close. What follows this is part of the same sequence, and it moves quickly.